And this is our fire and water panel. It's going to be hosted by Ruth Macera. Please join this panel of fire and water experts for conservation on local land stewardship and how we can tend our landscape to prevent wildfires, drought, and restore biodiversity. The panel is hosted by Ruth Macera. Thank you, Ruth. She's a local ecologist, and she's been working with these folks on watershed restoration, holistic land management in Crestone. Thank you, Fire and Water panel.
Sorry for being so loud.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. And I think we'll start with some introductions. So Sasha, since you have the microphone, you want to go first?
Sure, I was trying to pass it over there. But my name is Sasha Rabin. I'm a natural builder from California, working on more fire-safe built environment primarily.
Okay. Hello. Okay, the microphone is working. My name is Amber Liddell. I'm the hydrologist for the Rio Grande National Forest. I've been working with some of the folks here, and I think that's all.
Hello, I'm Benjamin Antonowitz. I'm the Baca Fire Chief and resident of the Baca for the past 15 years.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter May. I'm the Fire Chief for the Kundalini Fire Management and the Program Director for it. And I've been here since '93. And I think that was the 6th Energy Fair.
My name is Dustin Freita, and I'm from Taos. I'm a director for the Sacred Water Mountain Society and Earth Protectors, Water Defenders.
Cool, and I got my microphone here, so you guys are going to pass that one. So yeah, my name is Ruth. I'm a local ecologist, and I've had the pleasure of working with most of these people on different projects. And so we'll start with you, Dustin. Can you share a bit about what the Sacred Water Mountain Society does and the work that you have discovered in New Mexico with the water catchment systems?
So the Sacred Water Mountain Society was formed in 2017 after the No Dapple Standing Rock Indigenous Earth Movement up in North Dakota. And we're an indigenous community organization of earth and water protectors, but also indigenous knowledge, protecting and practicing and preserving indigenous knowledge and lifeways. The planting water, what I call planting water is, it's an ancient indigenous way of land management that hydrates the land, recharges the aquifers, utilizes all of our snow melt and monsoon runoff waters to recharge our groundwater, which in turn keeps our mountains and valleys healthy.
Beautiful, cool, thank you. And Peter, can you explain the relationship between fire and water and how watershed restoration can help with fire mitigation?
I'll take a crack at it.
Yeah.
I think we're still all learning about that. When Mark Jacoby, who just came in, and I kind of started things off at the Baca Fire, we didn't really have wildland fire gear. And so we got fire gear, we got new trucks, and over the years we got into mitigation, because we're trying to limit the amount of fire that's in the trees. We call them BTUs. And the old-fashioned way of fighting fire was to put the wet stuff on the red stuff, the water on the fire. And if we evolve that a little bit, we can actually, in addition to that, we can also balance the elements on the landscape itself. And so fast forward now to, the last few years, and Emily Fairfax was showing that a hydrated landscape burns less. And she studies the effects of beavers on Cameron Peak and East Troublesome fires, where there were numerous beaver dam colonies, and those places didn't burn. And now there's evidence all around the country showing that the hydrated landscape is less prone to wildfire. And we know in the fire business, if you have a wet year, you might have a really heavy fuel year the next year. So it doesn't mean it's going to work everywhere and every place, but it is something to take into account. And so the latest idea that we've been working with and working on is to rehydrate not only with beaver and beaver dam analogs, but with also mushrooms, because mushrooms have a way of holding the moisture with the mycelium. They have a way of, through the work of Suzanne Simard, showing that the trees share the nutrients and the water. And then the mushrooms also put off sesquiterpenes, which can provide the nucleus for the thunderstorms. So that's a little bit. And so we're trying to do it from an elemental balance perspective, not just a response perspective, more kind of paying it forward kind of thing.
Cool. So it's preemptive. Cool.
Yeah.
And Ben, can you explain a bit about the work of the Baca Fire Department and some of the issues that you guys deal with and the approach to your work?
Yeah, first and foremost, as the Baca Fire Department, our goal and our ideology is community protection, right? Fire suppression, emergency services response. And then unpacking from there, we're also working on forestry management, riparian area management, and fire mitigation. And so, you know, as a first responder services, that's our first duty. And then it comes into land management. And so we've been working very thoroughly on properly preparing the community for wildfire, increasing tree spacing so that we can have low intensity fires and not have a really high intensity fire because we have such a large population of homes in the Baca. And so fire mitigation is a big priority of ours, but we also want to work in a balanced way with the natural pinyon juniper savannas in the area and restoring the forest to a healthy way. So a big part of our goal is riparian area restoration. And so again, the goal is increasing water flow, promoting old growth trees, promoting healthy stands of native species on the green belts and the common spaces.
Cool, thank you so much. And Amber, since we're going around in this nice little circle, so one of the things that we're covering here today, you guys, is the connection between watershed restoration and this microclimate that we live in right here. And we have all these incredible creeks coming off the mountain, and it's what holds us here. So the reason that we can build these incredible sustainable houses, and we'll get to Sasha soon, is because the earth and the land is holding us. And so we have this water, and we have these watersheds. And there are some issues in the watersheds. We've had anthropogenic disturbances, which means that various things have happened. In the 1800s, we called many of the beaver here. We redirected the creekways, we mined. And so what we're trying to do is to restore the waterways so that we can keep the watershed high in the mountain and spread and sink the water and charge all of the creeks and the stream flows that we have in the area. And so just so that we can understand a little bit more about how the watershed works, I'd like to ask Amber some questions. Can you explain what the headwater stream is? And is Crestone in a headwater watershed?
Great. I am so glad that you asked that, Ruth, because a lot of this can go over people's heads without a little bit of background information. So we are in the headwaters right now of the Rio Grande River. A headwater is a high elevation, small stream called a tributary that flows into the main stem of the river. The headwaters are extremely important because this is the source water of the river itself. And I feel just so fortunate that I found the Rio Grande headwaters, because the Rio Grande National Forest just happens to be, you know, in so many of the headwaters of the Rio Grande River. And as a Forest Service employee, not all forests are like that. And a lot of For example, the Colorado River headwaters are on maybe 4 different national forests. And so the Rio Grande National Forest is super cool for hydrogeologists because it is all the source waters in one forest coming into the Rio Grande River. And so, should I talk about snow?
Can you talk about what happens to the creeks as they come off of this mountain and maybe
Yeah.
like the aquifer?
Yeah.
So just to explain like what our local ecosystem is comprised of. in
Yeah,
that way.
definitely. Yeah, the groundwater is really cool here too. So what happens is in this area in Colorado, the headwater streams are generally snowmelt dominated. So we'll get a bunch of snow. The snow will slowly melt and trickle into the ground. And actually, snow melt in this region is what makes perennial or year-round streams run year-round. It's that slow percolation that keeps the streams going later into the season. And so this is why it's so important to keep the water as high in the watershed as we can, because that's where it's not going to heat up as fast. It's not going to evaporate. That's why a lot of the dams up in the Rio Grande headwaters keep the water there instead of going down to Elephant Butte right away, because they know that the water's not going to evaporate. And so there's a lot of impact and positive change that we can make in the headwaters. And that's why headwaters are so special.
Cool.
So it's a really special place where we live.
Awesome. Thank you, Amber. And then on to Sasha. Going back to fire, because water and fire are the 2 major issues that we have here, elementally speaking. And so Sasha works with natural earth and building. And can you explain some of your work with advocacy in LA and some of the rebuild that's happening there right now?
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't speak too much to the actual interesting rebuild because there's not much happening yet in that arena. But there is a lot of people putting a lot of work into building back in a different way. And that might just be the tiniest percentage of the buildings that get rebuilt. But one of the things that is, I don't know how many, so I live in California, so very different climate, very different very different building climate, to say the least. And one of the things that people have really become aware of with some of the recent fires in LA, the Palisade and Eaton fires, is that just how toxic when places burn, when that is. So some of the work we're doing is just around acknowledging that some of our towns and cities will burn, and when they do burn, how can we have that be less detrimental for the air and the land? And so simply how do we put less plastics in our house? So that's one piece of the work around fire that's happening. And some of the fires that we've had there in the WUI areas, the buildings themselves are actually the fuel for the fire, especially in those ones in LA. It's not a forest burning. It's a very different approach than a lot of the other areas of the forest, like wildfire mitigation work that's happening with cultural burns and stuff. It's actually the buildings themselves are the fuel. And some of the response is like wanting to create a moonscape in people's yards, and that doesn't feel like the right answer. So how do we actually use our built environment to create more fire-safe urban landscapes?
Cool, thank you so much. And then we're gonna, I think, pass the microphone back to Dustin, because I like this thing that we got going on. So Dustin, can you just talk a little bit about your work and what you've discovered and how you have witnessed it hydrating the land and, some of the impact that you've seen from these water catchment systems and how efficient they are?
So I guess I don't know if I like to say discovered, but what I became aware of, I'll give a little backstory. I spent over 15 years homeless, and my family spent 3 generations displaced from what we call now Taos County. I'm a descendant of indigenous slaves with a Apache descendancy and Comanche descendancy and some Pueblo ancestors. So when I was homeless, one of my great uncles is still alive up in Denver, and he was telling me places where our family used to live, and a lot of it's national forest now. And so I was living in the national forest, and over about a period of a decade, I started to see common things amongst these different places I was living in the national forest, and over time it revealed itself. And I grew up really close to the land, and homelessness makes you even closer to the land. So I started to see these catchment systems, and the more I looked, the more I found. I started to explore, being in the mountains during the winter, during the spring, the summer, the fall, the winter, the spring, the summer, the fall, year after year. I started to notice more and more, that all these systems I was finding are associated with the greenest, luscious places we have left in our mountains around Taos Valley. And so I started to explore outside of these areas into other areas associated with our family and different things, and I started to find more of the same thing. And after years of studying these things, I continue to find more. I'm continue to learn, and over the past month, we just got LiDAR scans of some of these systems. And so now for the first time, we can see them on a big map and, really see the extent of the work and how it all works together in a big picture. So we have a map that stretches about 5 miles north and south and about 3 miles east and west on a particular watershed in Taos Valley, where we can see over 10 different catchment systems, and in our studying, one thing I would like to do is try to figure out how much water these things are catching annually, rough estimate. And another factor to it is we've been finding earth structures, that aren't just catching the water from the top of the mountain to the bottom, but also it's moving water back up the watershed to circulate and maximize the amount of water that's being caught and put into the ground. And on the systems that are still functioning, I found very few that are functioning well. Most of them have been destroyed by roads, development, just people not being aware of it. Generations of displacement, so our people aren't maintaining and passing on this knowledge, and so a lot of it's in a state of collapse. But even in its state of collapse, it's still functioning to some degree or another. And we're pretty sure it exists up here in these mountains too, because this is all the same valley as the Taos Valley. There's no separation. And a couple of 100 years ago, it was the same tribes that were in New Mexico that were up here, So we think this work's pretty widespread, and we've been doing a lot of effort in collecting the evidence for this stuff, because there seems to be no data, very little memory amongst our elder population, and yeah.
Cool, thank you so much. Peter, I'm wondering if you can talk about the relationship between what we call beaver dam analogs, or low-tech process-based restoration, being small dams in the waterways, beaver, and the relationship between a healthy riparian area being hydrated and also wildfire, and how those two things can interface.
Sure. I'll start though where kind of Dustin left off,
Sure.
and it's one of my Amber helped us put together the map of all of the creeks and streams here, and I only have small pictures, so if you come over to our booth, you can see it. And here's a question for everyone. How many creeks do we have? Right here, just in the local area. You don't get
Anybody
to answer
raise your
this.
hand? How many creeks do we have in the area? Take a guess.
Okay, good.
So
There's 4, right? We got
he's
North
saying
Crestone.
4.
We got South Crestone. We have Spanish, Cottonwood, right? Everyone knows that. Well, what we've been working on is Wilcox. Anyone know where Wilcox is? It's by your house, pal. You should know it. Anyways, it's an unnamed creek. The point being here, when you look on this watershed map, there's hundreds and hundreds of tributaries that'll just blow your mind. It's like, oh my gosh, where's this coming from? And that kind of awareness is lending itself to how do we work with the landscape relative to water, which then does affect fire. And again, I came at this from a fire management perspective. We know that water can balance fire, and so we're trying to slow it down on the landscape, in the landscape. And so we're using these strategies that Ruth mentioned, which is the low-tech process-based restoration techniques of PALs, post-assisted log structures, and then beaver dam analogs. And those are devices that slow down the water. They're still porous, they're not impounding the water. We're doing all this in alignment with State Bill 270 that Colorado passed a few years ago that allows this work. Before this was not allowed whatsoever. And so we're all just sitting back going, maybe someday we'll be able to do this. And the name of that bill is, or the purpose of that bill is to restore natural stream flows and floodplain connectivity. Many of our streams and arroyos, we'll call them dry creeks or arroyos, when the water runs, they're way down from the surface. Maybe a foot, maybe 2, maybe 3. Some of them out there where they mined, maybe 5 feet, maybe even more. And when you have that, the level of the water, the groundwater, is at least that low, if not lower. And so what you've done is you've taken away that surface, that ability of the water to go on the surface and then hydrate, and the flooding now doesn't really occur as effectively as it once did. And so a lot of this work is to slow the water and then to allow sedimentation to fill these back up in the best way that we can. We are hoping, and we're endeavoring to not only do this on the stream courses and the riparian zones, but in the uplands to slow the water there, and especially taking the water planting ideas from Dustin and then put them all together. And we're having to make sure that it's not going to flood people out. For being here for many years, 2 inches of rain per hour. If you remember those, Panorama had a 12-foot hole with a car in it. A lot of the road base up by Pinecone Way, it was washed away in that kind of storm. And so we're looking at, with the Forest Service, because they're our neighbor to the upslope, how do we diminish that? Because one flood like that can cause maybe $50,000 worth of gravel to come back in. That's expensive, especially if Shume had that experience just a few years ago. So just a couple things, and I'll finish for this round, is there's hydrological cycles related with beavers, and there's hydrological cycles related with mushrooms. And when you get to know this, and when you get to know the very microbioclimate that they need, they will start to make this more of a sustainable place in which to live. And that's what we're working on in just little ways. And what brings back mushrooms is low-intensity fire, and sometimes high-intensity fire. And no, we certainly don't want that where people and houses are. That may occur because our upper forests here in the Forest Service, that's their stand replacement, that's their fire regime, usually, or sometimes. But then the beavers, from, again, the work of Emily Fairfax, showing that, and in many places now, their effects are quite, they're quite diminished when the beavers are there, and they don't allow the fires to spread past a creek, because if you get to know it, not only is the ground saturated with water or rehydrated, but the whole air mass is. And we know from firefighting that from around here, a fire needs at least 35% relative humidity or less. And you walk, especially when it's really hot out here, go down in that creek, oh man, you get hit by this wall of humidity. You've got a natural fire break, and we're not even talking about vegetation yet. We're talking about a hydration because the water is there. So that's probably enough for this round.
Yeah, I just want to, before we go to Ben, I want to ping it back to Dustin real fast. So I want to talk about the idea of what we call biomimicry, but it's something that is like just from observation and having relationship with the land. You observe what the animals do, like for example, what the beaver do. So when we were looking at some of those dam structures and you were saying, yeah, you know, what the beaver do is when it's running over the dam, we would make them wide so that the force of the water is like spread and distributed so it doesn't blow the dam. And so that was one point that came up. And then the second point, before we go to back to the fire, is how can we work with roads when it comes to like planting water, and we have disturbed these ecosystems because we've come at it sort of from our like colonized perspective and we just settled here, but maybe we didn't do it in the best way, in the most efficient way. So we're actually causing erosion and we're causing flooding with the way that we've built. And so how can we begin to potentially mitigate some of that and work with the land to like reincorporate some of this like regenerative approach to where the water's going?
Well, the roads make really good waterways. Just from last night, the rain, I was walking from up the hill a ways down, and I could see all this sediment being washed out into the roads. And so we, on our roads, we try to make these little diversion points where it pushes water off the road, or a culvert where it takes water under the road and, releases it. But in a steep sloped area where there's grade to the terrain, that oftentimes creates more erosion, and it'll just start creating a cut. So, one simple thing we can do is, instead of just directing the water off the road to stream down and create more erosion in those steep areas, we can build catchment structures. You got to go based on how much water flow is possible in those areas. You want to build it appropriate. If you build it too small, it'll get overwhelmed and washed out. If you build it too big, it'll never fill up. But slowing that water down, catching it in just simple dugout bowl systems, and with the overflow to where it can go down to another catchment or in another catchment. And if you get really educated with how the water's moving and how the land's shaped, then you can even start practicing bringing it back up the watershed, stuff like that.
Cool. All right, so we're going to hop to Ben now and get back to fire. Ben, can you explain some of the areas where you've been burning, what the work looks like, and maybe some areas that you have flagged as the fire department that need mitigation? And are there any areas locally where we really need to be paying attention to the mitigation? Maybe somewhere where there's an urban wildland interface, and how you guys would go about approaching that.
Yeah, first point I'll make is, we try to mimic the sort of natural occurring fire mitigation practices from the buffalo and the lightning. So when we're doing our mitigation practices, we're really trying to put ourselves into the mindset of a low intensity fire.
Cool.
And there's a certain magnetism with the land that happens with fire. And so to the best of our ability, we're all humans. We're just trying to do the best we can. Yeah. But we try to mimic what a low intensity fire would look like and kind of follow that path, and also put ourselves into the skin of a buffalo, right? Trying to knock off low branches and act like a herd of animals that before fences and separating all the lands with, property boundaries and stuff like that. What would it look like to watch a herd of buffalo walk through our green spaces? And we really try to mimic that to the best of our ability. All that being said, it's a really tricky, delicate balance living in the forest, right? We all love living in the forest. We all love living here. But we decided to build homes in the forest. And so it's a really tricky balance with fire mitigation because in the old ways, like Dustin was talking about, more often than not, you would just get out of the way if you saw a fire. However, we built homes here. We love living here. So we have to do our due diligence and our stewardship practices of the best of our ability, creating a balance and a harmony between that, right? Is if you built a home there, then you should do the best practices for your home, for defensible space, for protecting your own home, and then us as, fire mitigation and Forest Service, our job is to also see the bigger picture, right, beyond the homescape and see what it looks like on a landscape scale, how we can mitigate high intensity fire. Because at some point, wherever you live, there's always going to be, lightning or non-natural occurring fires. And so we want to prepare for that as best we can by doing the work beforehand. And so, yeah, rehydrating the landscape, but also removing trees that are just unhealthy. There's a lot of overgrown, unhealthy stands, especially on riparian areas. And we're trying to promote, cottonwoods, aspen, willows, trees of that sort that help recirculate and hydrate the landscape and remove more drought-prone trees from those areas so we can create those natural breaks. So to answer your question specifically, we all live in an area of high fire danger. So the whole place needs to be mitigated in one way or another. So whether that be rehydrating the landscape or doing tree pruning, simple as that, or removing and building your home with best practices. Yeah, not building with certain materials that are more flammable, and that's a really big part of it. And high percentage of homes that build with natural fire-resistant material do much better more often than not. So yeah, I'll just say that much.
Cool, thank you. Can you talk about what some of those best practices are for people who are building?
Well, you have your home zones, right? So 5 feet from your home, right, putting gravel, rocks, having low vegetation has been found to be extremely effective. And then there's that 10-foot spacing, same thing, removing vegetation, or green shrubbery, things that are very fire resistant, having a nice landscape in that. And then, yeah, within 30 to 70 feet, having proper tree spacing, proper tree health, and removing highly flammable vegetation from that area. So really it's that first 70 feet from any structure is what people need to be looking at. And promoting fire-resistant species and not having overgrown or dead trees on your property is a big one.
Cool. And Amber, I wanted to ask you, well, okay, so I'll just interject here. This is also making me think of sort of the unification of the two approaches of fire mitigation and also water catchment and managing the water on your land. So I'm just throwing out there to some of the panel, and feel free to comment, and we can move after we talk to Sasha, if we want, into more of a popcorn style where we're just like having a conversation, and if someone wants the mic, just make a gesture or whatnot. Is that maybe we can do this fire mitigation and at the same time make sure that we are hydrating our land. So we can just observe where the water falls, where, like I've heard Dustin talk a lot about where does it pond on your land? Where is the water falling and how are we using that? And so I think that that's something that we don't always consciously think of when we own land, when we're stewarding land, is like what's going on exactly with the elements and really like working with everything in a connected way. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And then Amber, I wanted to ask you, why is it important that we spread and sink this water? And what's the relationship between snow melt and groundwater?
All of it, yes. Can I also talk a little bit about roads too?
Absolutely. Yes,
Okay.
please. Yeah.
I usually get ideas when other people are talking.
sure.
And so roads is a great thing to talk about. I don't know if y'all are aware, but the number one pollutant coming into waterways from Forest Service land is sediment from roads. So we are aware of this, and so yeah, it is actually extremely important to, for example, if you are, channeling the water off of the road, to not actually channel it directly into a stream, because that's just going to pour sediment into the stream. And so these catchments that Dustin's talking about is a great idea, somewhere where the sediment can settle out and not go straight into a waterway. So that's stuff that we have on our radar that we're trying to work on. Also, like Dustin was saying, a long time ago, we just came in and started diverting, started drilling, started building roads, and we were using the knowledge we had at that time, maybe without looking towards elders where we should have been. And so now I feel like we are trying to sort of repair some of the damage that was done back when we were working off not as much knowledge as maybe we had access to. So now the Forest Service is working on a new road stream crossing approach. It's called aquatic organism passage. And so now if it's a big stream, we want to try to actually build a channel under the road. And so we're placing rock, if the stream naturally has rock, and just trying to make it more fish friendly for just so they don't have to go through the metal culvert, and they have their rocks, and they don't have to be all weirded out by the metal. And so I feel like I already talked a little bit about snow melt creating a perennial water source. And so snow melt also, that replenishes our aquifer, that replenishes our groundwater. And so, yeah, that's extremely important. And it's sort of the slower the snow melts, the slower it can percolate gently into the ground. I did want to touch on flooding really quick.
Yeah.
Because it is a little confusing with if you are going to build like a beaver dam analog or some sort of structure to slow the water, it might pond, and it might kind of create a pool, and it's like, well, isn't this causing flooding? And it kind of is, but I guess the idea is that when the water is melting and it hits this pond, that is slowing it. And so that's what's reducing erosion. And so it's called attenuating flooding. To build these structures, it's like the water has somewhere to go and sit and slow. I don't know if I'm expressing this well, but
Yeah, I can see it.
but the idea is that it actually would not flood as bad downstream because it's slowing further up. And so it's really important to try to find good places for the water to settle out and let the sediment settle out before it hits main waterways. It's just
Cool.
some stuff to say.
Awesome, thank you. And Sasha, do you mostly work in rural places, or are you also, I know you're doing some advocacy in LA, and can you talk about the differences between, like, if you're building an earthen home in, what I would call the countryside, or in the sticks, or, if you're doing something like in an urban area, like what would be your approach? And let's try and bring in like the ideas of like fire and water into that, like flooding or.
Well, I might start a few threads that I feel like I've heard
Sure.
from people,
Great.
and sort of a bigger picture. Where I live in California, it's traditional Pomo land, and there have been cultural burns for hundreds of years. That is part of the how the indigenous folks there have tended that land is by doing intentional burns on the land. And one of the and there's beautiful resurgence in that, in bringing back some of that just traditional land stewardship knowledge. There's also a lot of places where people can't actually burn, whether it's because there's too many houses there or because there's governmental regulations, like actually the reservation land is actually harder to burn on than some of the other land. So then there's work being done to mitigate, mimicking the cultural burns. And what that looks like is removing a lot of the very old but stunted Doug fir. And that's just this perfectly beautiful round wood for building. So that kind of loops back. And it's, the larger your timbers, the less flammable they are. So it's actually not, an incredibly flammable material. So that kind of loops back into the building side of it, and just like ways that some of these different pieces are working together. And also in our area of California, just the need for new livelihoods and different industry and stuff too. So that's sort of an interesting, just piece of that that's coming together. And I work both some in the urban and the rural, and I guess and I feel like I spoke a little bit to the urban, and I think what comes to mind here specifically to speak to in the more rural, wooey, the area that we all kind of want to live, like in the edge of the forest, right? Which is like the most dangerous in terms of fire and the most appealing for like most of us, is just the importance of not just thinking because you built an earthship or because you built an adobe home or because you built a cob home and your walls are a material that aren't flammable per se, that your house is fire safe. And so maybe just like putting out the emphasis on the details. You can build an incredibly fire-resistant stick frame building, and you can build an incredibly not fire-resistant cob building. And I think that's in my past, some of the buildings I've built, and in a lot of the community of very, very alternative builders that I work with, that's something where a lot of emphasis has been given. So that's also part of our work lately, is like, just more emphasis on the details and making fire safe detailing. And it does cost more, which is the downside. And there was one other thing sort of on some of what Ben was saying in terms of just like what you can do in your local landscape, is looking at some of the buildings that survived, like the Eaton fire. Some of them had very short, usually cinder block walls around them. And so we've been advocating for like, let's do adobe cob walls around some of these houses in some of this area. And that actually can, especially the landscape where we are, where is a lot of like lower vegetation fires, where the low non-flammable walls can actually be just like a little detail that's incredibly beneficial.
Cool. And now, if anyone has anything that they haven't said that they would like to say, I'm just going to invite you to pass the mic back and forth and encourage a conversation. So if any of you guys have questions for each other, then please go ahead.
Yeah, I realized I didn't actually specifically answer the question about what the areas look like that we had burned on. The areas that we had done prescribed fire and or burn piles, in my opinion, just my opinion, look really good. I went and actually toured them yesterday. There's grass, flowers, a lot of species of shrubbery that are growing back. And so, in my personal opinion, I think those areas that we've burned in are more healthy and robust than they were before. And then one stat I was going to throw out that she reminded me of is, 80% of homes that burn down is after the flaming front has already passed. And so that's a really critical detail for when someone's building a home in a WUI interface area, is it's not the initial flames that will get the home, it's the embers and the smoldering after the fact. And so, having those low adobe walls or concrete around the base of a home, making sure eaves are covered, having good siding, putting up screens on anything that can catch an ember. And, we've seen brooms burn down houses afterwards because someone leaned a straw broom against the house. And so just, having the clutter away from the house. I'll just say that.
Cool. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, so keeping on the topic of burn, we did a prescribed burn with Ben and our 130, 190 class last year out near the Baca Refuge. And I got to take Brandon Miller from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out there because he's here because he's very interested in some of the work we're doing with lower cottonwood because it has Rio Grande chub and Rio Grande suckers. Those are known as aboriginal relic fish that may only exist in a very small part of this valley. And so when we became aware of that, because we're working with water, we got Colin Britton to come. He's a specialist there. And we wanted to make sure we were doing the right thing. And so he basically said, oh yeah, keep doing this. Because if you ever get out there, sometimes the water is as little as an inch or even dry, and the fish have adapted to scurrying on the wet sand into the pools. And that's how they've survived. And we all know, if you've lived here for any length of time, it gets 40 below out there. And how are these fish surviving is just amazing. We believe that it's because the beavers have been there and they've made that habitat. And so this isn't kind of the same neck of the woods. So that's why we're really trying to get beaver back out, because they were there 3 years ago. That's primary. Also for rehydrating the landscape. But the second part is that we burned. There's a number of us here that were on that burn. And I brought Brendan out. And what we were doing primarily there is reducing the rabbit brush stands. Rabbit brush, if you don't know that, that's the chamisa. That can have a 30-foot flame length because it contains natural latex. So we took it down, we mowed first, and in our burns coming up, we're getting into mowing, both with mechanical and goats, because Joanna Doxson at Atlanta, we've got like 20 or 30 goats we're gonna actually put in pens, and they're gonna start reducing fuels for us. But we burned, and he goes, oh my gosh, because we got the riparian vegetation back within a season, or within actually half a year. And he goes, your system is still intact. It's not coming back in like cheatgrass and things like that. It's not invasives. We're getting the Baltic rush and the native grasses showing us, and the snakeweed or the equisetum, that the water's still there. The rabbit brush just tends to soak it up and then make a very high fire danger. If you look way out there, because we believe it was overgrazed from about 1950 or maybe earlier as a very award-winning cattle ranch, they just ate the grass. They don't like the rabbit brush. So he then came up with the idea, maybe we should do this on the refuge. Main prescribed fire. And here's the reason. If you go out on the refuge, there are things called exclusionary fences right along cottonwood. And they're the only places where the willow and the cottonwood grow, because the elk will go and they eat everything. If they're not in a fence, it's done. And so that's basically what beavers eat. And that's what beavers make, basically slow down the water. And that's one of the pieces of the puzzle. And one of my good friends, Gordon, he has some willow for us. He was doing a permaculture workshop. So I went out and he said, hey, if you need any willow, I have it, because I'm going to take it down. I said, why are you taking it down? He said, because it's blocking my view. And he goes, I've never had to do that before. And I said, and then he goes, well, the 500 head of elk that used to come by don't, because there's too many houses. Showing the connection that 500 head of elk will take down a whole stand. And so the importance of fire here, or fire-like treatment, because we could mow and then feed, can be very, very important. He wants to do it out in the refuge so that the elk have all these different areas to graze on. And just so you know, the bison are out there, and when we burn, they come back. I'm from a place in the Great Lakes, and there's a traditional burning program there where they burned way earlier or sooner than the natural fire regime. They did that for hunting, and because they burn, they have every endangered species of southern Michigan and Ontario in abundance, because some species just need what we call perturbation or beneficial rearrangement, but it's our presence that's going to do that. And that's where we're hoping to evolve into, just like we have to get to know the land, very safely, like people that came before us have done, to make it better, not just for us, but for all kinds of species.
Dustin, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, and I know, Peter, we hold this as kind of our like founding beliefs, and it's something that I'm learning from you, and why I like to do the work with E3KFM is that, for example, there are some notions, and I'll throw out two terms. One term is shallow environmentalism, and another term is deep ecology. And so shallow environmentalism is this notion of we do something in the landscape or on the earth because we want to take something from it and because we need it, and we have maybe like a short-term view of why we're doing something. And deep ecology is, just in a nutshell, more the premise that we are the steward of the land. We have a relationship with the land. We are nature, and everything is running in this constant cycle of giving and receiving and giving and receiving and taking care of the earth as if it was our dearest family member, as if it's something that we are so incredibly grateful for and that we love and that we nourish. Not just to get some product from. And so I've heard you talk, Dustin, about this kind of thing, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the water catchment systems that you have discovered high up in these mountains and how people used to live with them. And does that make sense? So, like, I've heard you say before that, you know, if the earth gets a drink, then we get a drink. And so, yeah, does that make sense? What were you saying, Peter?
How we change the landscape so it's better for everybody. Because part of the
Right.
taking that step.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, back when we all had, back in all of our tribal ancestries, no matter where you're from on this earth, back when all people came from tribal people, um, we grew up on the earth. We were not separate. So that was kind of a naturally educational, ingrained instinct. So our ancestors, they didn't have to put a lot of work and effort into understanding and learning the land, because from birth you were on it. That was all you had. And so, through thousands of generations of observation and experimentation and everything else, eventually our ancestors were able to recognize, like, hey, what the beavers is doing is working. So let's now, the beavers deal with the mainstream, so let's take it up the runoff areas. And so, and also, like, one thing I say is, if the earth has her drink, we will always have ours. If your mother's taken care of, you'll always be taken care of. You know what I'm saying? And in the indigenous, our collective ancestry, indigenous way of looking at things, I think what I call our original commitment as humans to be on this earth was that we would only take what the earth gave us freely. And I think we really broke that relationship in that way, because we take what she doesn't give freely and we force her to produce more than she can maintain. So, our ancestral practices were, knowing that if we take care of everything around us, we're going to be taken care of. But today I feel like, we're stuck in this mindset that I need to be taken care of first in order to take care of the things around me. And it's a debate, but ultimately we're running out of water. We're running out of, what we need to live and to sustain ourselves. And so the planting water practice isn't focused on my personal well-being and my personal investment. It's more focused on, if the things around me are taken care of, then I will have everything I need. you know, and so the planting water was feeding the earth first and foremost, making sure she has her drink. And then that brings the plants, that brings the mushrooms, that brings the animals, that brings life, all that life that we depend on, right? And so, you know, I'd also like to touch on the flood thing because, you know, our two biggest threats right now are fires and flood. But the planting water, the ancient planting water, you know, these were masterminds. These, you know, a lot of what we do today is experimentation and trying to remember and trying to relearn things. But the ancient planting water systems are like, you know, picking up an ancient textbook of lost knowledge, and we get to study these systems and learn from the masters, learn from the people who perfected the work, you know. And when we, if you just imagine 6 inches of rain falling on this mountain slope up here, you know, over 5 miles, you know, and imagine all this 6 inches of rain, it's not going to soak in very little, you know, it's mostly rock up there. And so it's coming rushing down the mountain, and where it convenes, then you have all that water coming together and rushing down the mountain, and that is what creates the flood issues. Even in the Appalachians, when the hurricane hit the Appalachians a few years ago, all that water just ran down the mountain and washed everything out. And so these planting water systems are flood mitigation, because when you start catching that water at the top of the mountain, not just in one place, but every available opportunity, you know, then you, all of a sudden, you're stopping millions of gallons of water from rushing down and convening together to wash out everything. And you start spreading that out and soaking it in, and very little of that flood water will make it down to the bottom, you know. And so the majority of it will soak into the side of the mountain, and then when the water's in the ground, it moves differently than it does on top of the ground. If you've ever like spilt a cup of water on the ground and watched it soak in, it spreads out, you know, so that once that water soaks in, it spreads through the ground, and then it finds the path of least resistance within the ground. And depending on the geology and the soil makeup, rather clay and sand, like sand's a super absorber. It's a super water conductor. And so sand can suck up a lot of water really quickly and move water really quickly underground, whereas clay, it takes a lot longer for it to soak into the clay, but the clay will hold it, you know, and the rocks become a barrier that hold it back or hold it up, you know. And so you have all these different things at play. But when you start soaking in the ground, you're not just mitigating all the potential flood, you know, but like in the places we study and protect, you know, we had a pretty dry early start to the year. It was pretty dry, and we didn't have a lot of snow melt this past season. It wasn't, a lot of it evaporated, and it was really weird. But even though we had a below average moisture season and there was very little rain in the early part of the year, you could go to these water catchments that did catch the snow melt, what little there was. And even in the driest part of the year, where there's fire danger all over the valley, you could go into these ancient systems and turn over any dead log, and it was wet, even though everything else was dry, you know. And so that water is still there in the ground, you know, slowly moving, releasing into the stream system, stabilizing the streams, you know, instead of millions of gallons washing, flooding the stream and then disappearing, you know, it slowly sustains the stream like a, you know, a trickling income, and you know, and then that also recharges our aquifers. And so any surface water that exists in this valley, that surface water exists only because the groundwater, you know, holds it up. Once we lose our groundwater, then all that surface water goes down into the ground to replace that void, you know.
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was really great. So we've got a couple minutes left up here, and then we're going to hand 2 minutes. We're going to do questions. Should we move into questions right now? Okay, cool. So we are going to hand out my microphone. I'm going to give it to Kim. And if any of you guys have questions, please just holler or raise your hand. And yeah, thank you.
Okay. So just keep in mind the Free Box Fashion Show dance party's gonna show up. So we'll just keep going until they show up, okay?
Thank you for your presence. That was very good about the water. I just have a comment, not a question, but I'm a caretaker of the soil, and I'm Golden Bear from the Sioux Nation, and what we did to make the ground sacred, and it comes out of the Michael Tompkin Christopher Bird book of Secrets of the Soil. And at night with the new moon, you take rose quartz and you crack with a hammer something and it sparks, and you go to all the 8 corners of even here, and you plant a little piece of rose quartz in all 8 points of the bag wall, which is the octagon, and then in the center we call Pool's Heaven. And every time you plant rose quartz, you've set an intention of what you want to create in this space, and then that's how the energy works of making ground sacred. So thank you.
Yeah, I too thank you for being here. I'm interested in, you've alluded to the structures that convey the water back up the hill. Would you speak to that a little bit?
It's always the most fascinating part. It's hard to explain. It's a lot easier to show people than to explain this, but yeah, I could use my hands like the mountain, but I got the microphone.
Wait, I'll hold the microphone. I got you.
Well, I mean, I'll just try to take you through an imaginary, if people can imagine. Close your eyes, imagine. So imagine you're up in the mountains. There are all these different arroyos, ravines. There's all these different runoff points where over hundreds and thousands, millions of years, it's carved out erosion spots that, let's say are 100 feet deep. Now it's a little canyon valley, right? And you're walking up this little canyon valley, and so imagine that out, the grade is kind of steep, a lot of runoff coming off the sides of this little valley you're walking up, and then you got the main path of the water in the bottom of the valley, right? And let's imagine at the bottom of this valley, it's kind of wide and it narrows as you go up, kind of gets a little steeper as you go up. Common thing you see in the mountains, right? And so, this work would start at the top, but often we're approaching it from the bottom, right? So imagine at the bottom of this valley, there's a big catchment. And as you walk up this valley, there's catchments every 20, 40 yards, depending on how steep it is. If the steeper, yeah, just on average, these what I call mainstream structures, it's like a pond. It's like a dam structure dug out behind it with a very appropriate sized and shaped overflow system to where when it's overflowing, it doesn't erode the structure, it spreads out, and then it falls into another structure. So you have this step, right? And there's all sorts of different tactics and strategies on how they would move these water around. Some of these things are called water roads, because they're kind of built like a road, but every 20 yards they have a catchment in it. And so if you imagine you're walking up this valley and you have these mainstream catchments, but then on the slope, right, imagine, the water's coming down the valley, the water's coming down the watershed, right? And on this slope, you have a earth structure with these catchments. It's like a road, but with catchments. And it's running up the watershed, but slightly downhill, right? And so all the runoff melting off of this slope gets caught in this water road and fills up these catchments. And when it overflows to another one, all the way down this water road. And it carries the water back upstream into the main catchment system, but up higher. So, originally it would just kind of come down in, let's say, into the lowest catchment at the bottom of the system. But that water road catches it, takes all that water back up to the top of the system if possible, or as high as it can take it based on the land, the shape of the land, right? And then it releases it again. So it's maximizing the amount of water saturating into the ground. I hope that made sense.
That's so cool.
yeah.
Did that answer your question, pal?
Definitely. I really
Because you could do it at your house.
I don't have a stream there.
This isn't about streams. No, this is about runoff.
I know. Okay, one other thing, Mulligatha Mike, is I just wanted to emphasize that this is completely different. But when you put screen in your house, use the metal screen, not the nylon screen. Because the nylon screen, embers will burn through. That's all. Thank you.
Did everyone hear about when you're going to do your structure protection and your venting, use metal screening, not nylon? Is there a next question? Oh, Josh.
I've got my question. So my house sits at a local elevation minimum, so it might in fact be a catchment. What would you recommend for someone who wants to see the ecology restored but is in the line of fire of that mission?
He's in a floodplain.
You built in a floodplain or you bought in a floodplain? Did you build in a floodplain or did you buy it in a floodplain?
I bought in a floodplain.
Okay. Don't build in floodplains. If you don't know what a floodplain is, any low spot is a flood potential area. High is dry. If you're bought something in a floodplain, there's really not, it's, you kind of, if you really want to restore that area, you have to risk foundation issues. When the water table returns, you got to face septic system issues as the water table returns. So, it's a really hard place to be in. Ultimately, it's best just not be there. I know that's not probably what you want to hear, but
do you have a slope above you at all? I was just going to say you could try to slow down some of that water upslope and maybe channel it away from the area you're trying to avoid. Sort of catch it before it gets down to the low point if possible. So kind of it could be a berm or a road dip sort of thing, like where you just kind of use earth or something to channel the water away from that low point. I know I have a friend who's dealing with a flooding garage, and I was going to suggest that to him. Instead of trying to avoid it going into the garage, just trying to catch it kind of before it's at that low point and getting it to a different, kind of diverting the flow. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Okay, there were a couple other questions over here. Was it yours? Yeah.
Hey, Josh, come over to the booth, and Amber will be there. I know you have more to ask. Yeah. Come over to the booth, and go ahead, Tori.
Thank you all for the educating stuff here today. I was going to ask, since a lot of you are involved with different entities, how do you support continuity across monitoring with these projects? And what does monitoring look like here?
So that's huge. And before, 10 years ago, it was just a few of us. And now we are developing partnerships. And I'll take my hat off to Amber here. She has the hat on. If I had a hat, I'd take it off. She and Rosalie and William, Jason. Goes by Jason. Anyways, they're huge in helping us get money and their expertise. And then that's lending itself to other areas nearby. And then U.S. Wildlife. It's also Division of Wildlife, which, by the way, is just revalued beaver, and also the State Forest Service. And so it's also each group here and people who want to get involved. And especially, we're now working more closely with the Property Owners Association, and Ben's been a huge support for the burning, and really done. Fire is very, very tricky here. It's very tricky, and so is the water, especially when we get into a wet period. We have not been in a wet period. I mean, yesterday, yes. The day before, yes. But I'll take this moment. We are offering a 130, 190 fire class, hopefully with a prescribed fire this November, like we did last year. We're also doing a watershed. We have watershed maps at our booth, the yellow tent over there. And we're making a shirt. If you want to be a sponsor, come see us.
So, really good question. I think that really the key thing for monitoring when you have multiple groups working together is assigning a group or multiple groups to that monitoring. Have someone take ownership for it. The Forest Service has a monitoring program in place for our low-tech structures. So on Forest Service land, we're happy to monitor. And then I guess for other groups, it would just depend, who is going to be the assigned person monitoring. Because I think if you work with multiple groups, it's just really important to, decide, who's doing it. Because monitoring is so, so important. And you can't always get it perfect the first time, and you just can learn. So.
So we do photo monitoring across our projects, and so if you know how photo monitoring works, yeah. And then also we've been, as a small local agency, working and partnering with different organizations, learning about measuring the water flow and conductivity and taking EPA samples and stuff. So it's kind of an ongoing dynamic process. But photo monitoring these areas that we're working in, and then we will share our mapping technology. So if we have, if you stop by the E3KFM booth, we have a map of the project areas that we're working in. And when we're beginning a partnership with an agency, we'll be like, hey, here's our map of the project area, or this is what we've done so far, or this is our idea. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
And then real quick on our water monitoring, we're testing water off the Forest Service and logging it now. We're beginning that. We're learning a lot from Amber. But we also have a way of monitoring the species. We have these, if you'd like them, it's the Biodiversity Initiative. We've had PhDs and all kinds of people, herbalists, put together lists for over 30 years, and so we compiled them last year. They're in a booklet. And we also have iNaturalist for Saguache County. So if you do see something and want to share it, you can go there, or you can take this, and then at some point there's a checklist that you can see if you're finding these. And then at some point we'll call them back and see what we're finding. If it's really rare, we may not want you to tell where it is.
Not to, or? Okay. Ruth would like to make a comment about iNaturalist. It's a little bit complicated, but I think we're not wanting people to mark rare species on iNaturalist. I think it might be private information or just, yeah, we don't want it to be harvested, yeah. So I was just going to mention real fast on monitoring. I don't think that you asked specifically about how we monitor. We do photo monitoring and location monitoring. And we are monitoring water quality as well. We're hoping the water quality improves with the slow filtration of the water. But I was just going to mention that before we installed the structures, we did some surveys. My coworker Rosalie did some fish surveys, and I did a stream survey called a longitudinal assessment. And so we do some measurements, and then we can kind of see how it changes. It's going to be cool. We should talk about mushrooms too.
Does anyone else have any questions? How are we doing on time? We're done. Okay. So we have a booth, E3KFM, and so if you have questions, you can come to the booth. I just want to say one last point real fast, is that I want to bring all of our work together, and so working with all of these people has been amazing. When we had Dustin come out and look at our work, he made some really foundational observations. And I just want to bring back that point about like really, really ancient technology and how that has been like I like how you talked about it like an ancient textbook that's been passed down through ages. So we still consider ourselves like in ecological kindergarten, and we're still all learning. And I just feel very blessed to have you all here today. And thank you for sharing. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Sasha. And please, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Oh, yeah, and we have a sign-up sheet. So please come and sign up if you're interested in any of this stuff. And I'm going to hand the mic over to the beautiful and lovely Hey.
Okay, give another round of applause for our fire and water panel. It's great to get everybody's view working together as a community. It's always challenging, but these guys are really trying to bring old wisdom and management that needs to happen for our safety as well as the ecosystem here. So thanks for joining us.